Hey Frederico, how are you?
How are you, Patrick? Nice to speak to you again.
Yeah,
Hope you're well.
I'm glad to have you back on. We had a great conversation the last time. We talked about Brazilian markets and then oil and gas and Petrobras. So, yeah, definitely what we're going to talk about again. But before we do, tell me how you've been. What's new at Warren, where you're the head of research? Any
Yeah,
updates?
we've been changing some things here. I mean, the research department has been funded with the asset management. So we're now focused on the buy side, but I'm still digging research in Brazilian stocks as well as Brazilian credit market. But now from the portfolio management side instead of, traditional sell side analysis. So that's it. I mean, pretty much the same job, but on the buy side perspective. And Warren is good. I mean, we are with new bankers, we are with more AUM. So business is growing despite of Brazilian market. It's quite difficult nowadays, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Uh,
So, did you expand coverage at your research department? Are you covering any new sectors or industries or?
We cover pretty much the blue chip stocks in Brazil and as well as some small caps. We do cover mostly all of all sectors that have, companies listed in the stock exchange. So, I mean, we cover it all. We have a list of maybe 60 to 70 companies that we watch closely.
Cool. So we'll get into the oil and gas in a bit, but before we do, let's level set a little bit for listeners and just talk about Brazil's economy and markets in general. So, what's your current view?
Yeah, well, about Brazil, I mean, fiscal policy is the key issue when we look through the domestic market. Last year, in January 2024, the discussion in the market was rating cuts. So we thought early in January 2024 that in the end of the year, we're going to have the basic interest rate around 9.5 or 10%. But then in the middle of the year, the central bank had to hike rates again, especially because of the fiscal policy. We have been facing in Brazil in the last 3, 4 years GDP growth, large GDP growth than expected. And this is mostly because we did some reforms in the past, right? In the past, maybe 8 to 9 years. And after the pandemic, the reforms are raising. The unemployment is low, and we are facing higher growth than normal, right? Than neutral, right? So inflation has been rising above the our target. We have a 3% target, which is quite difficult for Brazil, but we have a limit, a higher limit for 4.5% per year, and inflation is above this 4.5%. So the central bank president had to write a letter to the ministry, as well as it's an open letter, everyone can read it. The market was paying attention to this. So, but anyway, the fiscal policy is dominating the monetary policy. So Brazil is spending too much. The revenues are raising. Because we have a huge balance of payments, the exports are good, the exchange rate is depreciated. We have, nowadays we are looking through Brazilian real. It's like $1 6 reais. So it's been, tough for us in terms of, everyone speaking about traveling or
Yeah,
living
yeah.
in the US or going abroad. It's quite difficult nowadays. But for Americans, for foreigners, it's quite cheap to come to Brazil nowadays. But anyway, the interest rate is high. The central bank is now hiking interest rates. The president of the central bank announced that there are going to be two more hikes of 10 basis points. So the interest rate will go to 14.25% in the next two meetings. And the market is expecting at least 15% in the end of the hiking cycle.
Hmm.
So 15% nominal interest rate is quite high, right? And it's justified because of the fiscal policy, the government spending too much, more than it raises in new revenues. So, the key issue in Brazil is the fiscal policy, the government spending. So the government has to accommodate the fiscal policy and has to explain to the market and negotiate with the Congress to limitate the budget, right? If this happens, if we see more new measures from the government, this could bring credibility to the Brazilian market, the financial market, and we can see local instruments like stocks, bonds, the interest rate, and the exchange rate performing well. But everything depends on the fiscal policy. I mean, the local stock prices, they are relatively cheap if you look through various metrics like PE, PVGO, dividend yield, price to book, everything, every valuation measure when we look to Brazil seems cheap when we compare to other emerging markets and as well as developed markets. But earnings growth is relatively pressured because of the high interest rates, right? So this hiking cycle, when we think about interest rates in 15%, this obviously gonna interfere in the company's net income because they're gonna pay more in financial expenses. So nowadays, thinking about stocks and bonds, we saw a flight to quality movement. It has been very intense, this flight to quality movement. So investors are looking more to dollarized companies because the exchange rate is higher, commodity companies and infrastructure, utilities, banks, right? Investors are getting away from cyclical domestics because, of course, these sectors are the ones that suffer the most when we see this level of interest rates, right?
So then where do you put your money in terms of industries in that scenario? Is it time to buy cyclical domestics? I mean, small caps are pretty beat up in Brazil, or do you think you're waiting to see what happens with the fiscal situation to make the
Yeah, we,
decision?
we do have small cap portfolios. We do have exposure. However, we are doing this same movement, the same flight to quality movement and the small cap universe as well. So we do have exposure to financial sector. We do have exposure to some cyclical domestics, but it's quite small exposure. When it comes to portfolio management, it's small exposure. We do have exposure to oil and gas, to materials, utilities, but we do prefer those non-cyclical sectors and companies that have a clean balance sheet with net debt, negative net debt, or maybe a low net debt. So they're gonna pass through this scenario and start growing again, but with no issues related to higher interest rates. So the market is looking very closely to leverage because when we have this hiking cycle, I mean, it's quite different from the US, right? We never saw a 15% interest rate in the US. So in Brazil, when this kind of thing happens, people just sell leverage companies, right? Because they're gonna suffer the most. And this happens with in the credit market as well as in the stock market. So in the credit market, we have seen in these last weeks, maybe AAA or AA companies in local rating, right? But those companies, maybe if they have a lot of leverage, maybe 3.5 or more, we saw like interest rate plus 5%, plus 4%. So, I mean, if the interest rate goes to 15%, the companies are paying like 19, 20% per year in financial expenses. So this is tough, right? You're gonna need to have a return higher than 20% per year, which is not common. It's not easy, right? So that's the thing, that's the issue, right? So, and for interest rates to go lower, we're gonna have to accommodate the fiscal policy. We're gonna have to cut expenses. So the credibility it would bring credibility to the market, and the central bank could contain these interest rate hikes or maybe start lowering the interest rates. But this is gonna happen maybe. I mean, I don't see this happening until the mid of the year. We're gonna have two, as I said, we're gonna have two more hikes, same basis points in each next meeting. So in the next two meetings, 100 basis points in each one. So, I mean, maybe the central bank will wait later. Maybe it will go through other hikes. We don't know, but I don't see this scenario changing the next 6 months.
Yeah, I agree. It's a tough environment when interest rates are 12 to 15 and real yields are like 7 to 10. Why buy stocks? That's such a big hurdle rate when the overnight rate's so easy and the real yield's pretty good. So yeah. I kind of get that feeling too. I look and I see a bunch of really good companies trading at very reasonable valuations, but you kind of just get the feeling that the market's not ready to bottom yet. That it's going to be more hikes.
Momentum is very tough. That's it. And thinking about the money flow, the retail investors, they don't make the price here in Brazil. So We depend on institutionals and foreigners, right? The foreigners are not coming nowadays. Yeah, and institutionals are the retail investors and other pension funds and asset allocators. They are withdrawing resources from equity funds as well as hedge funds. So the hedge funds industry as well as the equity mutual funds industry is shrinking. So last year we saw like more than 100 companies closing doors. I mean, the equity industry in Brazil, now it represents like 7 to 8% of total assets under management. So the credit industry, it's kind of in the top. And the equity and hedge funds, they are in the low of the cycle. So, I mean, we do not have a buy force nowadays. It has to come from foreigners because that's where the money belongs, right? So we talk to foreigners, to allocators, as well as hedge funds, and they have like 0.5% exposure to Brazil. And if they go to 1% or 1.5, this is huge volume for us. So when the foreigners come, that's when the volume comes together. So the technical, it's kind of this volume has to come. So we need this buy force, right?
Yep. And it's I don't know, it feels to me like it's a hard sell at the moment, right? Brazil's the brand in the investment world. It's not great at the moment, and I think a lot of international investors can be distracted with the Trump inauguration and all the stuff that's going on there. They're just going to be focused elsewhere. And I don't know who's going to step up and want to take the career risk on investment councils and suggest doubling the allocation to Brazil as it stands now. So I don't know. Hopefully, I think they come eventually, but I tend to agree. It's not going to be the first half of this year.
Yeah, exactly. I think that, they're gonna wait until we can see, a trigger, especially related to the fiscal policy, as I mentioned.
Yeah, cool. So let's get into Brazil's oil and gas sector then, because, you're one of my best sources. For whoever didn't listen to our last podcast, Petrobras as well as any analyst in the world, I think. And yeah, it's a fascinating sector. So why don't you just tell me what's going on with oil and gas in general in Brazil?
Okay, so well, that's one of our bets, right? Oil and gas in Brazil, we have some competitive advantages. I think I commented that in the last podcast, but we faced issues last year in 2024. The general production didn't go up last year, despite the new projects that we have in the pipeline. I mean, Brazil has a huge capex for the next 5 years, especially because of Petrobras. Petrobras is expanding production in the pre-salt. But we do have competitive advantages. As I said, we have low cost production. Petrobras is producing around $5 per barrel in pre-salt. If we consider all the royalties that it pays for the governments and as well as the freighting for platforms for the FPSOs, it goes to a limit $20 per barrel. So all in $20, $5 lifting cost. So if you put that on balance, I mean, Petrobras is a cash cow nowadays, and 70% from its exports come from pre-salt. So and the production is ramping up. So I mean, Petrobras will grow in the next years in terms of production. The question that the market goes through nowadays when it comes to Petrobras is much more related to the domestic fuel prices because Petrobras is controlled by the government, and the government has almost half of the controlling of the company. But it has the power to indicate the CEO, some of the board members, and the ministry influences directly in the company. So that's one of the market concerns. It's always been. And that's why Petrobras negotiates with some discount when they look through multiples when we compare to Shell, Chevron, and other majors. But anyway, the question that the market does make here in Brazil is much more related to the difference between external fuel prices like diesel and gasoline when we compare to the domestic prices, because when the exchange rate goes higher and the Brent goes higher as well, Petrobras needs to update the prices to go up with the prices, right? So and nowadays when we look through the external prices and domestic fuel prices, it has a difference about 20%. right? So Petrobras is selling 20% cheaper than if it imports the diesel and gasoline. And this creates some artificially cheap prices here in Brazil, but it affects the refining margin from Petrobras. It affects the specific segment, which is the RTC, refining, transport, and consuming, right? So the consumer. So when we go through to the fuel prices, that's the key issue related to Petrobras, and there is a pressure from one side. The market pressures Petrobras to go up with the prices, but from the other side, the government says, no, come on, you need to wait a little bit. You don't need to pass this volatility to the market because this going to have an effect in inflation. And of course, the government does not want inflation. So that's the key issue. If Brent stays around 80 per barrel and the exchange rate stays around 6 reais per dollar, Petrobras will need to update the fuel prices somehow in the moment this year. This 20% difference between external fuel prices and domestic fuel prices could not be sustainable for a long time. I mean, Petrobras could wait a little bit and do not pass the volatility immediately, but if it stays like 20% difference in 3, 4, 5 weeks, it has to pass to the consumers. So this affects the margin of the company. But anyway, it's quite different from the Dilma government 10 years ago, because nowadays we have the press out. So when we look through the EBITDA of Petrobras, the net income, we're going to see that it comes mostly from exports, from the upstream segment. So the downstream segment, midstream segment, if it goes zero, it doesn't matter. The problem is that if it goes negative. So that's what the market's paying much attention. And the other thing is related to the capex deployment. So Petrobras has a huge investment plan, and the investment plan is not only related to the upstream. The market X that Petrobras invests more in the upstream segment because there's nothing more profitable than producing oil with $5 cost. So Petrobras needs to go further with the pre-salt plan. However, there are lots of other investments that are secondary and that the returns are lower, like the refining segment. Petrobras is investing in biorefineries, in solvents, in petrochemicals, in natural ESG, right? So Petrobras has other investments that complement its portfolio. However, the market is paying much attention in the capex deployment. It's like $20 billion per year. It's around something around that. However, Petrobras is not in the last years. This $20 billion, Petrobras couldn't invest too much. So the capex deployment curve is in a pace slower than it was sold to the market. So Petrobras intended to invest 20 billion. It's not, and the company is not investing 20 billion. It's investing like 18, 19. And if we go to the dividend policy, Petrobras, it's the difference between the operational cash flow and the investing cash flow. Petrobras pays 45% in ordinary dividends. Yeah. The difference, you multiply 45%, and that's the dividend policy. So if Petrobras invests less than it plans, we're going to see more dividends. So that's what happened in the last year and 2023, when Petrobras released this new investment plan for the next 5 years. The release was made in November 24, and it was for 25, 26, 27, 28, 29. And the investment plan, the total amount was higher, but deployment was postponed. So 25, 26, Petrobras will spend less than 27, 28, 29. So the market reaction was quite good, because the market thought, well, so we're going to see more dividends in 25, more dividends in 26. 26, we're going to have a new election. So maybe the political party in charge nowadays, we're going to expect that it's going to be expelled. So we're going to see another management, and this investment plan could change. So the market is taking a look closely in 25, 26, because after 26, everything changes because the government will change.
Is that the essence then of the big controversy? I mean, there was a widely publicized, debate controversy about Petrobras's dividend policy in, early 2024, right? And you had talked about in our last conversation, some of the structural changes in the like professionalization at Petrobras compared to, Lava Jato beforehand when it had a terrible reputation as a corrupt company. So is that the essence of the debate then? Was it the trade-off between CapEx spending and current dividends? The current government wants higher dividends, so they spend less on CapEx, and then they can spend the money out in the Brazilian economy?
Yeah, it's kind of that's the debate because the market is looking closely to the dividend in the short term. The government, of course, it has other intentions, and the thoughts much more. It should be more related in the long term. The current government thinks that Petrobras has to invest not only in the upstream but also in the downstream, refining, ESG, whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the market look to this and say, wow, come on, I prefer dividends in the short run and capex deployment in the upstream segment. We do not want refining and whatever. So we do want a higher return or higher dividend. That's what we want, right? Stock owners. So that's the debate. However, there's another key element in this debate which is related to the fiscal policy. So I told you earlier that the government needs to cut expenses or raise revenues, right? But the revenue raise, of course, it affects taxes normally. So, and the taxes in Brazil are extremely high. So people just do not want to pay more taxes, right? But who's the major stock owner of Petrobras? It's the government. So if Petrobras pays a higher dividend, it helps the government budget. So that's why the government will not cut dividends in Petrobras, and that's why I believe that Petrobras could pay extraordinary dividends as well, because it will help the government with the budget. So that's why I'm kind of skeptical in this debate when it comes to Petrobras not paying dividends because it has to invest. The government needs Petrobras dividends, so it won't change. Petrobras will still pay dividends in the next quarters, this year, the next year.
So you mentioned the market preferred the upstream development. Is the equatorial margin still the big project? Is that still the most prospective, drill sites in Brazil?
Yeah, there's still a debate. IBAMA, which is the environment regulator, didn't approve the license until now. But I think that it's kind of, we don't have a timeline for this, but sooner or later, this will happen. Okay, that's my opinion, my perspective. The CEO of Petrobras, Magda Chambriard, she works for Petrobras like in the last 20 to 25 years, but she has been ANP, which is another regulator, national petroleum agency. She was a director in ANP, and she was one of the defenders of the Margem Equatorial exploration. So she's very engaged in this negotiation, and the government intends to go further. So I think that's it's kind of the decision is not clear because we spoke with technicals from the sector, and people say that Petrobras could go further. It has the technology, it has the experience, and others ambientalists say that the equatorial margin is quite different because we are close to the Caribbean, we are close to the Amazon. The oil spillover will affect like this the biodiversity forever. So Petrobras intends to argument that it has all the controls and the spillovers won't happen, and if it happens, they have like emergency measures. But it's quite a difficult debate. And I think that will take a while for this to happen. So I don't think that the market nowadays put equatorial margin into account. So I don't see that in sell side models, buy side models. I don't think that this is in the price. I think that this is kind of huge. Huge optionality, right? But I don't think that this is in market prices. This is implied in market prices. What happened last year, 2024, is that ANP and IBAMA, the two most important regulatory organisms in Brazil, they were down. There was a strike, so they spent like some months spending license with lower velocity. So it affected the upstream sector, especially offshore production in 2024. All companies suffered, not only Petrobras. Petrobras is a huge one, of course. It suffered most, but in terms of volumes. But PetroRio nowadays it's the major independent oil and gas producer. not state-owned control. But Rio, for instance, they have a field which stopped and they couldn't obtain the license to go back with production. They acquired another field called Wahoo, and the license didn't appear in the correct timeline. The same happened to Brava Energia, another independent producer. So the regulatory landscape interfered a lot in the sector in 2024. The projects didn't go as expected because of these regulatory issues. So I think that 2025 would be better for the sector, for all companies, because this seems to be normalizing. But for external investors, I mean, they look through this and say, "Oh, come on, this is bullshit." Emerging market issues. This is I don't want to stay here and have these regulatory risks that I couldn't sustain, that I couldn't monitor. Right? This is kind of non-diversified risk. So when we look through this specific allocation in Brazil, right? So we weren't expecting this. Even us, that we look closely to the sector and monitor the companies. This is kind of a risk that we can't measure and we can't quantify. So when it happens, the sector goes down. Yeah, so we looked to the performance of the oil and gas companies last year. It was poor performance. The stock market in Brazil had a poor performance, minus 10% medium. But anyway, we had a good perspective for the sector, but this regulatory landscape interfered 2024. For 2025, we expect more profitable, the companies being more profitable and the production expanding.
Yeah, Petrobras actually did okay last year. It didn't
Yeah,
rocket up,
Petrobras
but it held pretty steady
yeah.
while the rest of the smaller producers in Brazil in general were down. So I guess Petrobras stock was a bright spot. Are there any
Exactly.
other ways to play the equatorial margin? I mean, is there an international producer that has relevant exposure where it might actually show up in the stock price? Are there small cap drill stories that just own, prospective places to drill? Or is
Yeah,
Petrobras probably the best way to play equatorial margin?
no, Petrobras is probably the best play. The smaller companies in Brazil, they also have some exposure to the equatorial margin. They acquired some of the blocks there, but they gonna wait until Petrobras goes there and do the first job, right?
Yeah, I don't know.
So they're gonna wait
Maybe,
Petrobras and then maybe they're gonna go further.
I don't know, buy Guyana government bonds, maybe. I don't know, because they own a bunch of it too, right? I remember,
Exactly.
I think it was last year the headline that Venezuela was talking about invading Guyana basically to take their portion of the equatorial margin, right?
No, no, Venezuela doesn't have money for that.
Yeah, they can't develop it, right?
Brazil would go and maybe help Guyana. I don't think that
Yeah,
this is gonna happen.
no. So I want to ask you one question going back to the domestic versus international price, right? Because I'm curious. In Brazil, I know that ethanol is a big deal when people fill up at the pumps, right? It's the largest flex fuel car fleet in the country, right? So if gas prices eventually normalize domestically, does that mean ethanol consumption is going to increase? I mean, does that play into the ethanol markets in Brazil at all?
Yeah, we do look through a basic math rule because, the gasoline in Brazil has 28-30% ethanol. So it's blended, right? So when you go to fuel your car, you're gonna see ethanol prices, and you go into the gas station, you're gonna see ethanol price and gasoline prices. So you multiply the gasoline prices for 0.7, and you see, the fair price of ethanol, and we compare. So people would go to ethanol if it's lower than 0.7% times the gasoline price. So that the basic rule,
Okay.
that's what we compare, right?
Interesting. Cool. So let me ask you then about a couple of the smaller producers. You already mentioned PetroRio. We talked about them a bit last time. Are they still, the gold standard for private producers in Brazil?
Sure. Yeah, Rio is the low cost producer. They have a clean balance sheet. They have, a scale for independent producer in Brazil. Of course, Petrobras maybe has 30 times more production than Prio. But for independent producer, they are around 100,000 barrels per day. And maybe they have the possibility to go 140, 150. So they have the possibility to increase like 40 to 50% production in 25, 26, mid 25 to 26. So I think that's kind of very good growth story in Brazil. To be honest, we do not have Brazil is a dividend yield story, right? We do have lots of companies companies that pay good dividends, that are quite stable, that generate free cash flow, and sometimes are negotiated with a very good discount in terms of PE or price to book or any other multiple that you want to look through. However, when you look through growth, earnings growth and revenue growth, when free cash flow growth, the companies here are not into this kind of growth story as we see in the US. Tech companies growing double digits like every year. It doesn't happen in Brazil with most of the companies, but we do have some growth stories that worth to comment. And I think that in the next 10 years, two companies have been the major growth stories here. PetroRio, which is a utility energy company that goes into problematic zones and problematic concessions and does very good job in terms of restructuring and developing the region and going up with margins. And the other company is Prio in the oil and gas segment. I mean, this is quite good story in terms of capital deployment. I mean, every project they go through, they have like a 20% IRR after inflation in dollars. So they have like very good historical returns, and they have new projects going on. So it's a company that produces oil around $7 to $8 per barrel. All in. It's a company that the management is very capable. Every single manager that goes through operations, they came from Petrobras, they came from other majors. They have the experience to go there, and they have the track record as well. And the difference between Prio and other competitors is that Prio only buys fields that are declining production, and they revitalize and expand the timeline for this field. So they have a huge track record to buy a field from Petrobras that's producing 30,000 barrels per day, and they leverage the production to 40, 50 barrels per day. So they have it's an extremely good story in terms of capex deployment and ROIC, return on invested capital.
Yeah. So I think I saw a post of yours highlighting one of PetroRio's debt instruments maybe 6 months ago, a while ago. I think it was trading at CD plus 7 or something like that. Does that sound right?
Yeah, it's inflation plus 7.
Okay,
it's
that's
inflation plus.
So that's 12% more or less right now.
Yeah, because there are in Brazilian market, we have those instruments called incentivized bonds, right? And those incentivized bonds are for infrastructure projects, oil and gas projects, mining projects. Those kind of projects are the companies could create debt instruments, go to capital markets, and those debt instruments are tax exempt for retail investors. So we could invest in Prio's bond, incentivized bond, and this is going to pay, for example, the real interest rate in Brazil plus like 1% or maybe 0.5%, but it's tax exempt. So if we invest, for example, in the government inflation bond, this will pay nowadays inflation plus 7.5. If we invest in Prio's bond, for example, it would pay inflation plus 8, but tax exempt. The government bond is not tax exempt, right? So that's the major difference.
Okay. But in general, then, what would you say to maybe international investors looking at Brazil's oil and gas sector? Would you start with the equities or some of these debt instruments, tax exempt or not, just in general? Where do you want to be on the capital structure in the industry right now?
Yeah, the oil and gas sector also has external bonds. Those investors in the bond market could have exposure to Petrobras or Prio through debt instruments that were raised in the US. And most of those instruments that they raise debt here in Brazil, they swap to US dollar because their revenue are mostly based in US dollars. I think that the major opportunities related to equities come to oil and gas sector. I think that Petrobras is a good story. I mean, it's more a long run story because it didn't start last year, but it won't finish the next. So Petrobras is a long run story because we have this equatorial margin, we have the pre-salt ramp up, which will take like 4 to 5 years. So I don't think that until 2030. This is going to happen. I think that Petrobras is a long run story. However, Prio has short and medium term triggers to leverage production. I think that the valuation nowadays is very, very cheap. Talking about maybe 3.5 EV EBITDA in a company that will grow EBITDA like maybe 40 to 50% if it increases production. So that's a bargain, in my opinion, in one of the most efficient companies, in my opinion, the most efficient in LATAM. So efficiency, low valuation, good management, not state-owned control. So that's why I think that, PetroRio is a major opportunity when we look through Brazilian oil and gas market nowadays.
So let me ask you about one more company, because there's not that many independent producers in Brazil. And 2024, there was a pretty major merger between two of them, right? 3R and Enalta. And it's now called Brava, right? BRAV3, I think, is the ticker. It's a fairly decent sized company, right? It's like $2 billion, more or less, 12 billion reais. So yeah, tell me about that merger. What happened? Because the chart after the merger is kind of crazy, right? It dumped pretty hard, and it seems to have been a pretty big rebound. So what's the story? I don't know much about it.
Yeah, we suffered this. We have exposure here. But nowadays is going back. We're not losing money anymore. We're earning money nowadays. But anyway, we had this exposure before the merger, right? So when it was an Alta. We didn't like 3R before the merger. Now, after the merger, the new company has a better management, has a better governance. When we started looking through an Alta, it was a small company, only one field called Atlanta, an old FPSO. This old FPSO had lots of problems related to production stoppage. The bombs were very old. The FPSO could only produce 20,000 barrels per day. So lots of issues. The company was controlled by Queiroz Galvão, which is a company that was involved in Lava Jato scheme 2014. So it had governance issues. But then we saw an opportunity in mid 2023 because Enalta, the governance was changing because this company that controlled, this family that controlled the company called Queiroz Galvão, they had other companies, and those companies that they owned, some of them go through bankruptcy. So some of the banks, like Bradesco, Itaú, and the huge banks there in Brazil, they had Enalta stocks as a covenant. So, they received Enalta stocks to cover the debt that was not paid. So when this happened, Queiroz Galvão was diluted, and we saw this as an opportunity because the management changed and they had a plan to change the FPSO, to invest in other fields, to buy participations. So they changed the directors. They brought to the company one of Décio Odoni, which is one of the major specialists in Brazil oil and gas. He was like former Petrobras, 20 years, and then ANP, the national regulator, managing director. So a lot of experience and the right person to be in charge of the company. And then they made this investment plan. They went to the financial markets. They raised capital to invest in a new FPSO from Winston. They brought this FPSO to Atlanta, and they bought other participations in two other fields. So the company changed dramatically and started 2024 as another company, much more diversified, and a possibility to increase production in its major field, which is Atlanta. So this field would go up from $20,000 barrels per day to 50,000 barrels per day. So a huge increase in production with a modern FPSO. So this was basically the thesis behind our investment in Enalta. Then in 2024, both Enalta and 3R, they announced the merger, right? And the market was thinking that this was a good story because 3R had complex balance sheet in terms of debt, and Enalta was kind of clean. So the two companies' balance sheet together would be quite reasonable in terms of leverage, etc. And they're gonna have a portfolio combined, which was quite interesting because they have a refining asset, they have transportation asset, they have offshore, they have onshore. So it's a kind of an integrated company. Only one integrated company listed in stock exchange and independent, right? Because Petrobras is state owned. So this was a good story, and we stayed as investors. However, after the merger, saw some issues related to governance because they had paid too much for the management. People got bonuses without vesting. People didn't have a timeline to sell stocks. The banks behind, like Bradesco, Itaú, they didn't have these terms in the contract, so it created a pressure to sell the stocks. So we saw this movement until maybe September, and then October, November, the company released material facts saying that has stopped its operation in Papa-Terra, which is one of the major fields it operates. So the license was expired, so they're gonna need another license, and the license only arrived in late December. So as well as the production in Atlanta ramp up. So in late December, everything changed for the company because it finally received the license to operate Papa-Terra again and the license to operate Atlanta with the new FPSO. So it starts 2025 with this upside in production compared to last year. And the company is trying to sell the onshore assets. The valuation is around $2 billion. So they're going to receive a lot of money from this transaction if it goes further. They have 5 bid proposals in the table. I don't know about the dollar amount because it's not public. However, we do know that maybe it's a question of time, right? So in the next months, we're probably going to see an arrangement to sell the onshore assets, and the company will focus more on the offshore segment. So I think that there's still opportunity, but in terms of risk reward, I prefer the exposure nowadays to PRIO.
No, yeah, but it's an interesting story. So for anyone that follows oil and gas stocks, that's definitely one to look at regardless, because it's an interesting story for sure. And it seems like there's some uncertainty and volatility in the price. So maybe people are missing something. There's an opportunity because it seems like it's been a crazy year.
Yeah, and if we saw the short selling, I mean, it's around 20% of the market cap of the company. Short selling. I think that, if we see like 2 or 3 news, positive news, maybe the short selling will be stopped. And the other thing that you mentioned, it's quite good to comment, is that the sector in Brazil went through, a revolution in the last 5 to 10 years. If you look back, 5 to 10 years ago, we had Petrobras like a monopoly here in Brazil. And then Petrobras, after Lava Jato, Petrobras' strategy was to sell the minor fields and invest only in the major fields, especially in pre-salt. So Petrobras investing more in pre-salt and selling those smaller assets. It created the perfect environment for new companies to buy those minor assets from Petrobras and start leveraging production. So that's what PetroRio went through, what Brava Energia went through, PetroRecôncavo and Alta. So this environment was very positive for Brazil. It was a win-win situation because Petrobras focused on the pre-salt, and the other companies, the independent companies, could leverage production in those minor fields. And then nowadays, I think that after we went through all of this, I mean, there are still some fields that the minor independent companies could bid and obtain participations, but most of it has already happened. So nowadays, I think that the sector is passing through a consolidation process. And the merger that we saw in 2024 is the big example that we can go through.
Yeah, makes sense, right? I think 2024 was the first year where oil was Brazil's largest export. It passed soybeans for the first time. And you had told me the last time we spoke that regardless of new production, Brazil is going to be, I think, the 5th largest oil producer by 2030. So I guess that's the new trend, right? I mean, maybe soybean prices rebound, but in general, Brazil is a major oil producer for years to come, right?
Exactly. Cool, and last year, as I mentioned, the production didn't go up because of those licenses that in the regulatory landscape.
Exports went up, but total production didn't, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
So any final thoughts before we wrap up? I don't want to waste too much more of your time. So where can listeners find you? Anywhere I should send them?
Oh, Patrick, first of all, thanks for the opportunity to speak with your audience again. I mean, it's a pleasure to talk to you and to explain a little bit more about what's happening in Brazil, right? I mean, we're not too optimistic in the moment. However, maybe the next time we talk, things will be different. I'm quite positive about oil and gas in Brazil. As I mentioned the last time I've been here, it's not a short run story, it's a mid to long run story. The production won't go up like in 3 or 6 months, but if you think about 5 to 10 years, I'm certainly that Brazil will be very competitive in oil and gas landscape when it comes to the geopolitical perspective. Brazil will be very significant, and that's why OPEC, for example, always tries to involve Brazil in negotiations and deals. And the OPEC Commission came to Brazil the last year, so I think that is quite of it's a matter of time. It's not about if this is going to happen or not. It's just a matter of time. About Brazilian stocks, I'm not that positive. I think that we're gonna need to see triggers before the money come. But to your audience, pay attention to those triggers because when it comes, I mean, Brazil is cheap. Brazil is an investable country. Despite being an emerging market, we do have mature capital markets. So I think that it's quite good to pay attention to this movement because when it comes, it could be fast, right?
Yeah.
And if we do have appetite, can start positioning because we never know when this trigger comes, right? So moderate allocation. I mean, start low. However, I don't think that's good to be off records in when it comes to allocation in Brazil. I mean, it's reasonable to have a small piece and then start allocating once we see those triggers coming.
Great, man. Well, this was interesting, just like the last time. So thanks so much for doing this, and we'll do it again soon.
Oh, thanks, Patrick, for the invitation.
Be good.